The HOA president thought he could get me arrested just for walking my dog, but when the police showed up, the truth flipped everything against him. Before we dive in, I want to know, what time is it where you're watching this, and where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments below. I moved into the neighborhood because it looked like the sort of place where life stayed in its lane. The lawns matched, the mailboxes stood at equal heights, the sidewalks were free of the kind of cracks that trip you in the dark and leave you swearing at the night. The brochures called it a covenanted community, which sounded like commitment but mostly meant a binder of rules that arrived with the keys. The binder was heavy enough to flatten a stubborn corner of carpet, and for weeks, that is exactly what it did. I didn't open it because I didn't plan to test it. I cut my grass, I stacked my bins, I waved at people who never waved back. There was, however, a rhythm to how power moved here, and the metronome sat in a tidy house with navy shutters directly across from the community greenbelt. The HOA president liked to park his power where everyone could see it. He didn't wear a sash, but somehow you could tell. His hedges were trimmed like a military haircut. His garage door closed with the kind of tight seal you only see in commercials for weather stripping. He was punctual about trash day and pious about parking. He was the man who double-checked the latch on the neighborhood's self-image. I noticed him first because he noticed me. Every morning, I walk my dog along the narrow strip bordering the greenbelt, that soft edge where private yards frayed into community grass. The map in the welcome packet labeled it a common area, the neighborhood's contact print from a time before the fences. It was a good place to let my dog sniff the gossip left by squirrels and sprinklers. The president noticed each pass like a librarian noticing smudges on a window. He didn't wave, he assessed. He watched the leash, the shoes, the length of time I paused. He watched the way my dog sat before crossing the path, as though obedience were a barometer. The first letters came in envelopes that matched the tone of the houses, neutral, unthreatening, unpleasant only in the way of medical pamphlets. They were friendly reminders about authorized paths and community where unsensitive turf. They gave me directions nobody else seemed to follow. If I threw a ball for my dog, the letter croaked about off-leash perceptions, even though the leash never left my hand. If I stood under a jacaranda tree while my dog drank water, the letter opined about gatherings and extended activity in common spaces. It was language designed to skim your nerves like a breeze, not a gust. It wanted to chill without rustling anything. I responded the way everyone does at first. I made smaller loops and quicker stops and memorized the places where the lawn bled into a mulched border. I polished my compliance, thinking it would shine enough to blind his scrutiny. It did not. The next letters arrived with more urgent verbs. The president pivoted from reminding to directing. He copied the board, which meant the vice president 30 houses down and a treasurer who had the handwriting of someone who shortens words in her mind. The letters accumulated on the kitchen counter like a flock of pale birds. Their dates lined up like steps towards something I pretended not to see. Neighbors fed me folklore between hedges. There were stories about a woman cited for wind chimes, about someone forced to repaint a door because the shade of red suggested a different zip code. People told these stories with the relief of having survived something and the shame of having complied. It felt like learning the rules of a club while discovering why the club was careful not to call itself a club. I started carrying the binder with me, at least metaphorically, remembering where it lived under the corner of carpet and how it waited like a dormant volcano of clauses and definitions. The incident that made everything snap was small enough to be ridiculous and large enough to be inevitable. The community greenbelt had just been aerated, the earth pricked with neat little punctures like a giant had stepped on it with golf shoes. Stakes and ribbon marked off the center, but not the border path where people jogged in kids' road scooters. I kept to that border with religious focus, my dog at heel, my eyes on the stakes. The president watched from his porch with a ceramic mug held like an emblem. I felt the weight of his gaze the way sailors feel the weather change. When I reached the far end of the greenbelt, my dog veered half a paw onto the sensitive turf, drawn by whatever scent threads tie together a dog's brain. I corrected immediately, a tug and a step back onto the path. The imprint in the soil was the size of a coin. It was also, I realized later, the size of an excuse. The president rose with the slow importance of someone standing to recite a pledge. He crossed the street with an expression that matched the hedges. He gestured, not to me, but to the ground, to that coin of evidence. He didn't need a conversation, he needed a moment to expand into. There are points in a neighborhood where the space seems to tighten around an event, where the sky loses interest and the sidewalks lean in. This was one of those points. The president pulled out his phone as if drawing a badge. He tilted it to capture the paw print and the ribbon and the fragile holes in the soil. He framed a narrative with the competence of a person who has rehearsed the angles. He paced his words, I could see his jaw set through the glass of his demeanor. The posture of the phone said he was recording, documenting, archiving a truth he intended to feed into the machine of consequences. The email arrived before I finished my loop. It bared the subject line like a blade, violation of Greenbelt maintenance protocol. It contained screenshots of the video, which made the paw print look like a crater. It cited sections of the bylaws that, when I finally pulled that binder out from under the carpet, did not exist. The sections were adjacent to real rules but numbered like a misprint. It was a trick easy to miss if you trusted the author and a trick impossible to unsee once you caught it. The email added a deadline and a threat of fines. It copied the board in something called compliance, which I later learned was a committee of 2 people and a spreadsheet. I spent that evening with the binder open on the table, the dog snoring against my leg like a sandbag. The bylaws were a hybrid creature, part legalese, part homeowner heartbreak. Amid the clauses, I found a map with shaded areas and a legend that identified the border path as permitted dog walk perimeter, provided the animal remained on a leash and the handler removed waste. There was nothing about aeration seasons. There was nothing about footfall impact thresholds. There was, however, a clause I had skimmed a dozen times without understanding its bite. The HOA could not escalate any alleged violation to a municipal authority without first issuing a written warning and offering a chance to cure within 14 days. The incident had happened that morning. The email claimed I was in repeated violation and that the board had voted to escalate, a phrase that fit neatly into a sentence and poorly into the law. The vote, if it had even happened, would have been out of order. The escalation, if attempted, would be premature. I assembled the receipts the way a person stacks sandbags in slow rain. I took photos of the border path from 3 angles, timestamps carved into the metadata. I lifted text straight from the bylaws and pasted it into a draft reply with page numbers bolded as if to anchor the words. I printed the map and circled the perimeter with a highlighter that smelled like a middle school locker. What I did not anticipate was the president's impatience. The next morning, before the 14-day clock could even wind itself, he staged a spectacle. I saw it from my kitchen window first, the rake of his posture in the yard, the gathering of 2 board members like satellites, the presence of a contractor in a polo shirt with the community logo stitched onto the chest. They stood at the border path as if in prayer. Then the president walked to the apron of my driveway, held his phone again with badge-like clarity, and performed outrage for the small audience of their own authority. He spoke with his hands in a way designed to be seen by the street's doorbell cameras. When I stepped outside, it felt like stepping onto a stage mid-scene. My dog sat at the threshold, ears forward, reading the tone of the air. The president pointed to the path as though pointing at a spill. He gestured at me with the body language of a person delivering a verdict. He did not need my words, he needed my presence to complete the tableau. He paced the curb as if measuring it for a crown molding. The board members nodded in unison with the rhythm of his narrative. The contractor shifted, professional patience sliding into boredom. The call to the police happened not as a last resort but as an opening gambit. It was a trick he had used before, according to whispers that blew through hedges like a draft. He dialed with ceremony. He amplified his voice just enough that the numbers of the address traveled to anyone within earshot. He used words like trespass and property damage and non-compliance, quilting them together into something he hoped would wear like a uniform. He described my dog with an embellishment he thought would matter. He included the word aggressive, not because it was true, but because it is a key that opens doors to outcomes. I watched it happen with that slow-motion clarity people describe after car accidents. The street seemed to widen and flatten. The sky gave nothing away. The neighbors' blinds became a row of tight-lipped spectators. I stood with the binder in my hand, the ridiculousness of that image not lost on me, a homeowner clutching a book as defense against the machinery of accusation. I thought about the clause, no escalation without warning and cure, and how a call to the police is escalation with sirens. I thought about the map and its labeled perimeter and the tiny paw print that had become a planet in the president's galaxy of control. The sirens did not blare when the patrol car turned onto our street. It came quietly, like a surprise guest at a party nobody wanted. The cruiser's paint reflected the tidy symmetry of our cul-de-sac. The light bar, dormant, hinted at drama that might not be needed. The officer inside was a silhouette for a moment, a shape behind glass that condensed the entire situation into 2 letters on a uniform. The car rolled to a stop with the kind of measured grace that makes time feel like a string pulled taut. Neighbors who had never waved before appeared in their doorways. The contractor straightened his polo. The board members became statues with name tags. The president smiled a smile that looked like a mouth rehearsing for a photo. My dog shifted his weight inside. I held the binder the way people in old movies hold family Bibles, not out of piety, but because it contains a story you need to prove really exists. The officer opened the door and planted a boot on asphalt, bringing the authority of the city onto our curated street. The air recalibrated around that presence. The president stepped forward with the enthusiasm of a host greeting an honored guest. He gestured broadly toward the path, the yard, the dog, the entire idea of me. He radiated the confidence of a man who believed he had set a trap clever enough to ensnare anyone not paying attention. The officer adjusted his hat, scanned the scene, and let his gaze settle on me, the person holding a binder in a driveway, the person whose side of the story had been compressed into a handful of nouns and a paw print. He began walking toward us, the kind of walk that makes silence rearrange itself into a drum roll. And that was the exact moment the narrative threatened to harden into whatever shape the loudest person wanted until the next decisions, the next documents, and the next steps would pry it open again. The officer's approach was deliberate, a kind of calm authority that carried its own gravity. Each step pressed against the tension strung tight across the cul-de-sac, and every neighbor leaning behind curtains seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the script to unfold. The HOA president puffed up, ready to hand the officer a narrative already rehearsed in his mind. In his posture, you could see a man certain of victory, certain that the badge and uniform would translate his complaints into unquestioned action. But the officer's eyes told another story. They swept across the street with measured patience, taking in not just the people but the stage they stood on. He noticed the bright ribbons still staked in the ground, the coin-sized paw print the president had so carefully framed earlier, the tidy lawns that suddenly looked more like a set than a neighborhood. The gaze lingered, shifting from the board members who stood like props to the binder in my hand, thick with highlighted pages and sticky notes. The president spoke first, of course. His voice carried the urgency of someone who believed he was narrating the climax of a long battle. He gestured wildly toward the greenbelt, painting pictures of destruction that never happened. Words like trespassing, damage, and defiance rolled out with theatrical flair, designed to sound official and threatening. His performance included the exaggerated detail that my dog was aggressive, that he had endangered the sanctity of common ground, that I was a repeat violator who ignored written warnings. He layered the accusations like bricks, hoping the weight alone would crush resistance. The officer did not take notes. He simply watched, hands resting calmly near his belt, face unreadable but attentive. It was the kind of listening that unnerves those who expect quick validation. The president's voice grew louder as if volume would carve authority into stone. He turned, gesturing to the board members for confirmation, but their nods looked forced, shallow imitations of support rather than conviction. The contractor shifted uncomfortably, sensing this wasn't the kind of job he wanted to be part of. When the officer's eyes finally met mine, there was no accusation, only an unspoken question. That was when I stepped forward, binder in hand, and explained, not in the rush of a guilty person trying to defend themselves, but in the steady cadence of someone who had done their homework. I spoke of the bylaws, pointing to the very map marked with the permitted walking perimeter. I described the 14-day rule, the clause that prevented escalation before notice and cure. I held the binder open, letting the officer see the highlighted lines, the sections that contradicted every claim the president had made. The officer leaned in, scanning the page with the calm curiosity of someone sorting truth from theater. He took his time, running a finger along the line where the text clearly stated the HOA's limits. His silence was heavy, and for the first time, the president's confidence flickered. He stepped closer, trying to redirect, insisting the rules were broader, that the HOA had full discretion, that my dog's paw print was undeniable proof of damage. But the officer's eyes had already moved from the binder to the ground, back to the binder again. The logic of law was sturdier than the flimsy scaffolding of exaggeration. Neighbors edged out of their doorways now, emboldened by the shift. They didn't speak, but their presence swelled the moment with unspoken judgment. The president's performance, once staged for dominance, was collapsing under the weight of quiet scrutiny. He grew defensive, his gestures sharper, his words less measured. He demanded the officer take action, to treat this as a matter of criminal trespass. He even motioned toward my dog, who lay calmly by my side, tail thumping lazily against the driveway, hardly the picture of aggression. The officer finally spoke. His words were measured, professional, and clear. This was not a police matter. The bylaws, he noted, were civil in nature, not criminal. A paw print on the edge of a greenbelt was not vandalism, not trespass, not a crime. He explained that without municipal ordinance, without tangible damage, there was nothing to enforce. He emphasized that the HOA's dispute belonged in meetings, not police calls. The president tried again, voice cracking with frustration, pressing about community order and precedent. But the officer cut through the noise with calm finality. His role was to uphold the law, not HOA preferences. The rules the president had twisted for convenience meant nothing outside the small, paper-thin bubble of HOA power. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. The officer closed the binder gently, handed it back to me, and gave the president a look that carried both authority and warning. He reminded the president, firmly but politely, that misusing police resources could itself become a problem. He suggested resolving disputes through proper channels, through board meetings and arbitration, not emergency calls designed to intimidate neighbors. And with that, the officer stepped back toward his cruiser, his presence shrinking the inflated drama into something small and petty. Neighbors retreated behind doors, shaking their heads, murmuring into phones. The board members shifted uneasily, realizing they had aligned themselves with the losing side. The contractor excused himself quickly, muttering something about another job down the road. The president, however, stood frozen, stripped of the performance he had orchestrated. His authority no longer looked like discipline, it looked like desperation. His eyes darted from the retreating officer to me, binder still in hand, and the cracks in his carefully maintained facade widened. I had won the moment, but I knew this wasn't over. People like him don't surrender, they regroup. The binder in my hands wasn't just evidence, it was now a shield, something I'd need more than ever. Because a man who had just been humiliated in front of his neighbors, by a police officer no less, would not fade quietly into the background. The battle had shifted, but the war was far from done. The officer's departure left behind an eerie stillness, the kind of silence that swells after thunder when everyone waits for the storm to return. The police cruiser rolled away, its absence a heavy reminder that authority had sided with me, not with the president. But where reason might have settled the matter for some, for him it ignited something darker. Defeat in public had scratched his pride raw, and pride, once wounded, lashes out with venom instead of retreat. For the first day, he vanished. His curtains stayed drawn, his front porch, once his throne, empty. Neighbors whispered, speculating whether he would step down or double down. The board members walked past me with stiff smiles, neither acknowledging nor denying their complicity. It seemed, for a fleeting moment, like maybe the public humiliation had clipped his wings. But deep down, I knew better. Silence wasn't surrender. Silence was planning. It began with the letters. The envelopes no longer carried the polite beige tone of reminders. They arrived in aggressive stacks, stamped with bold red headers like warnings on medical bills. Each one accused me of something new: grass an inch too long, trash bins not returned in time, holiday decorations not conforming to neighborhood standards. The timing was suspiciously perfect. Letters appeared within hours of trivial events, as though someone was watching constantly, waiting for any excuse to pounce. Then came the fines. They started small, $50 for yard maintenance violations. Soon it was $200 for excessive noise, though I rarely had guests and my dog was quiet. Every accusation was absurd, but the system was designed to wear people down. The goal wasn't money, it was submission. He wanted me to fold, to admit defeat in the face of endless paper attacks. I responded carefully. Each letter was met with evidence, each fine challenged with photographs and timestamped records. I began building a file thicker than the binder itself, documenting every move. I refused to be worn down, but I also understood the stakes had shifted. This was no longer about a paw print in the soil. This was about power, about his need to prove he could bend me to his will. The harassment expanded beyond paper. Subtle signs appeared around the neighborhood. A neighbor whispered that the president had warned them about me, claiming I was a troublemaker who brought police into the community. Word spread that I was reckless, disrespectful of rules, dangerous even. Parents pulled their children closer when I walked past. Conversations quieted when I stepped onto the sidewalk. A man can endure fines, but isolation cuts deeper. He wasn't just trying to punish me financially, he was trying to exile me socially. At night, I began noticing strange things. A car idling too long near my driveway. Motion lights flickering at odd hours. Trash cans mysteriously knocked over. Small acts of disruption that carried the stink of pettiness, but arranged with precision. It was his way of saying, "You might have won the officer, but I control the shadows." He was crafting a world where suspicion hovered over me like fog, where every day carried the weight of someone else's gaze. Through it all, I reminded myself of one truth: documentation was my weapon. I kept a journal of every incident, logged dates and times, saved every letter and photograph. I invested in small cameras for my porch and yard, capturing the moments of accidents that seemed too intentional to dismiss. I was no longer just living in the neighborhood, I was building a case. And still, he pressed harder. The board announced a sudden inspection of properties, a maneuver meant to comb through every corner of my home for violations. He framed it as routine, but neighbors admitted they had never seen such a thing before. Inspectors paced my lawn, peered over fences, scrutinized every detail with the intensity of detectives searching for contraband. Their clipboards scribbled furiously, and I could see the president watching from across the street, arms folded, smirking as though the world was bending back into his hands. The letters after the inspection multiplied. They cited issues that didn't exist, contradictions that clashed with their own bylaws. It became laughable, almost theatrical, but the weight of it all pressed heavily on me. Every day felt like preparing for trial in a courtroom where the judge was also the accuser. Neighbors began to splinter. Some, tired of his antics, approached me quietly to share their own grievances. They spoke of unfair fines, of rules enforced selectively, of intimidation when they resisted. Others, too fearful of crossing him, pulled away from me completely. Lines were being drawn in our manicured lawns, and the president, though wounded, was regaining ground through fear and persistence. The true escalation came one evening when a notice arrived not in the mailbox but delivered directly to my door, hand-signed by the president himself. It accused me of creating a hostile environment for the community, citing the police incident as evidence of disruption. He claimed I had brought shame upon the neighborhood by involving outside authorities. The letter threatened further action, though it left the words deliberately vague, a shadowy menace hanging in the air. I read it twice, then 3 times, my pulse heavy in my ears. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a direct challenge, an ultimatum cloaked in bureaucratic ink. He was daring me to escalate again, to step outside the rules he twisted so easily. He wanted me cornered, desperate enough to stumble, to give him the satisfaction of proving his narrative true. But what he didn't realize was that his obsession had left a trail, a web of deceit easy to unravel with the right eyes. And as I stared at the letter, I knew exactly what I had to do. The police had sided with me once because of evidence. Now, I would gather more than enough to expose not just his lies but his abuse of power entirely. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was preparing for war. Retaliation could only go so far before it exposed itself. The president, blinded by his need to restore power, had crossed into recklessness. What he didn't realize was that every letter, every fine, every contrived accusation had been neatly filed away, transformed from harassment into evidence. And with each new escalation, he gave me more rope with which to tighten around his own authority. The first step in my counterattack was research. I combed through the HOA bylaws like an archaeologist digging for bones, uncovering fragments of forgotten rules and contradictions hidden in plain sight. The binder, once a nuisance, became my arsenal. It revealed loopholes the president himself had overlooked, provisions that limited his power, and requirements for transparency he had long ignored. Meetings were supposed to be public. Fines required documented votes. Inspections had to be scheduled with notice. Every rule he had broken was etched in ink, waiting to be wielded against him. The more I read, the clearer the corruption became. The board, stacked with his allies, had failed to follow procedure countless times. Minutes from meetings were missing. Votes were undocumented. Funds collected from fines had no clear accounting. A trail of negligence and abuse stretched back further than my own battles, touching neighbors who had quietly paid fines just to keep peace. He hadn't just targeted me, he had built a regime of intimidation that thrived on silence. I began to speak with those neighbors, carefully and quietly. The stories poured out once the first person broke the dam. A woman confessed she had been fined for a non-standard mailbox despite using the same model as half the street. A young couple admitted they were threatened with legal action for parking their car in their own driveway. An elderly man whispered that he had paid thousands over the years just to avoid the constant harassment. Each testimony layered another brick onto the case I was building. Some were too fearful to go public, but others, emboldened by the memory of the police siding with me, began to see cracks in the president's invincible armor. Together, we began collecting more than stories, we collected proof. Photographs of violations ignored for his allies. Copies of letters stamped with arbitrary fines. Bank statements hinting at misuse of funds. The community, once cowed by fear, started to stir with the quiet energy of resistance. Meanwhile, I attended every board meeting, binder in hand, camera discreetly recording. The president sat at the head of the table, smug as ever, barking out rules and dismissing questions. But now, every word was being captured, every contradiction catalogued. I asked questions he tried to brush aside, only to circle back with evidence that forced him into corners. Each time he raised his voice, neighbors shifted uncomfortably, realizing the man who claimed to represent order was unraveling under scrutiny. The pressure mounted until the board itself began to fracture. The treasurer, once loyal, grew visibly uneasy when asked about missing records. The vice president faltered when confronted about inspections conducted without notice. Their silence became as telling as their words. The president's confidence cracked, though he tried to mask it with bluster. He leaned harder on his authority, tightening his grip, unaware that the harder he squeezed, the more people slipped through his fingers. Outside of meetings, his harassment persisted. More letters. More accusations. More desperate attempts to cast me as the problem. But now, instead of isolating me, his attacks galvanized others. Neighbors began approaching me openly, offering support, sharing documents, even volunteering to speak against him. What had once been a one-sided war was slowly becoming a rebellion. The turning point came with finances. A neighbor slipped me copies of budget documents, poorly concealed and riddled with inconsistencies. Thousands of dollars in maintenance fees had no receipts. Vendor payments were made to companies with no traceable existence. Fines collected in cash had vanished without record. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was theft disguised as governance. And it was the kind of discovery that could end not only his presidency but his reputation entirely. I realized then that this fight was no longer about my dog, my lawn, or even the petty fines. It was about exposing the rot at the core of the HOA. The president had built his power on fear and secrecy, but I now held the key to dismantle it. The binder was no longer my shield, it was a sword. Still, I knew he would not go quietly. Men like him never did. He would fight with every ounce of energy he had left, wielding threats and intimidation until the very end. But I was no longer standing alone. The neighborhood was watching. The board was splintering. The officer's words still echoed in the background. This was not a police matter, but if his corruption spilled beyond civil rules, it would become one. And as I pieced together the puzzle of his misdeeds, I realized the day was fast approaching when I would put everything on the table. A meeting loomed on the horizon, one where the evidence would be impossible to ignore, one where his carefully constructed image would shatter under the weight of truth. For the first time since this war began, I felt something powerful, not fear, not anger, but anticipation. The tide was turning, and he knew it. His silence was no longer planning. It was panic. The night of the HOA meeting arrived like the peak of a storm that had been building for weeks. The community clubhouse, normally half empty and stale with the scent of old coffee, was packed wall to wall. Neighbors who had never shown interest in HOA affairs came out, their faces taut with curiosity, frustration, or quiet rebellion. The air hummed with tension, the kind of charged silence that comes before a verdict. The president sat at the head of the long table, his navy blazer pressed sharp, his posture stiff with authority. He tried to wear the expression of calm leadership, but there was something brittle in his demeanor, a crack in the mask. The board members flanked him, though the distance in their eyes betrayed their wavering loyalty. Each had grown weary of carrying the weight of his decisions. Each seemed to sense that tonight would draw a line they could no longer straddle. The agenda was simple, a thin sheet of paper that listed community updates, upcoming maintenance, and a Section 4 violations and enforcement. But everyone in the room knew why they were there. They hadn't come to hear about landscaping budgets or pool repairs. They had come for blood or, at the very least, truth. When the floor opened for discussion, the president launched into his performance. He spoke of chronic violations, of persistent non-compliance, of one homeowner who had disrupted the peace and integrity of the community. His voice boomed with the confidence of a man trying to bury the truth under repetition. He gestured broadly, his hand slicing the air, his words sharpened with the force of authority. To him, I was the problem. I was the cancer eating away at the harmony of the neighborhood. But this time, his theater fell flat. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Neighbors exchanged skeptical glances. They had heard the stories, seen the endless letters, and lived under the weight of his arbitrary rules themselves. The old tactics of fear and exaggeration no longer carried the same punch. The more he spoke, the more his words sounded hollow. When my turn came, I stood slowly, binder in hand, the weight of weeks of preparation pressing against my chest. I wasn't nervous. I was steady, sharpened by the exhaustion of constant battle. My voice carried not anger but clarity as I began to lay out the evidence. First came the bylaws, the passages that proved his accusations had no foundation. I read aloud the section on permitted dog walking areas, the clause requiring 14 days of notice before escalation, the rules about inspections that he had ignored. Each line was a stone placed carefully into the wall of truth I was building brick by brick. Then came the letters, dozens of them, each dated, each contradicting the bylaws. I displayed photographs of my lawn, time-stamped images of trash bins, evidence that disproved every accusation he had hurled. The crowd leaned forward as the pattern became clear. This wasn't enforcement. It was persecution. But the real blow came when I revealed the financial documents. Copies of budgets and statements, highlighted with missing funds, unexplained payments, and vendors that didn't exist. I presented testimony from neighbors, written accounts of fines paid in cash that had never been recorded. The room shifted as whispers turned into gasps. This wasn't just about petty harassment anymore, it was about corruption, theft, betrayal of trust. The president tried to interrupt, his voice rising, his face flushed with panic. He slammed his hand on the table, declaring my evidence false, fabricated, irrelevant. But the treasurer, pale and trembling, finally spoke up. She admitted the books didn't balance. She admitted the president had ordered her to sign off on payments she couldn't verify. Her words, halting but honest, cracked the last pillar holding up his authority. The vice president followed, stammering as he confessed he had gone along with inspections he knew were improper, pressured by the president's demands. Their confessions, reluctant but undeniable, stripped the president of the board he had once controlled so easily. His allies had abandoned him. The room erupted. Neighbors who had suffered under his reign stood and spoke, their voices trembling with years of pent-up frustration. They told their own stories of unfair fines, intimidation, harassment. Each account piled higher, until the president's carefully constructed empire collapsed under the weight of its own lies. His composure shattered. He shouted over the crowd, calling them ungrateful, disrespectful, liars. He pointed at me, insisting I had orchestrated a conspiracy, that I was poisoning the neighborhood against him. But the more he raged, the smaller he became. Authority no longer clung to his words. It drained away with every accusation, leaving him exposed, desperate, cornered. Finally, a neighbor called for a vote. The room fell silent as hands were raised, one after another, in favor of removing him as president. Even his former allies voted against him, their faces marked by shame and resignation. It was unanimous. In one motion, the power he had wielded like a weapon was stripped from his hands. But the battle wasn't over yet. The evidence of financial mismanagement, the missing funds, the falsified documents, those weren't matters the HOA could simply vote away. Those were matters that reached beyond community rules. Those were matters for the law. As the crowd dispersed, the president sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the papers scattered before him. His reign had ended, but the shadow of what he had done still hung heavy in the air. The neighbors left buzzing with a strange mix of relief and disbelief, whispering about police reports and legal consequences. And I knew this was the final stage. The officer who had once told him this wasn't a police matter might soon find reason to return, not for me this time, but for him. The days after the meeting carried a strange weight, as if the entire neighborhood had exhaled but didn't quite know what to do with the silence that followed. For the first time in years, the president's voice no longer boomed through our streets. His porch was empty, his shutters closed, his power stripped away with a single unanimous vote. Yet beneath the quiet was something unsettled, a hum of unfinished business that hung in the air like static before lightning. Because while his reign of intimidation had ended, the evidence of his corruption still lingered. The missing money, the falsified fines, the phantom vendors, all of it demanded more than whispers and HOA votes. It demanded justice. And justice was no longer in the hands of the board. It was in the hands of the law. Neighbors who had once feared him now stepped forward with courage. Copies of receipts appeared, emails surfaced, photographs and testimonies poured in. Each new piece of evidence added weight to the file I had been building, transforming it from a personal defense into a case too large to ignore. Where once I stood alone, I now had allies, ordinary homeowners who had grown tired of being victims, tired of bending under the pressure of one man's abuse of power. Together, we brought our case to the authorities. The same police department that had once stood in my driveway now opened their doors to hear the full story. I watched as officers sifted through the binder, the letters, the financial records. They saw the missing funds, the manufactured violations, the pattern of harassment that stretched across years. What had once been dismissed as a civil matter now revealed itself as something more, a web of fraud and intimidation woven under the guise of community leadership. The investigation unfolded quietly but steadily. Officers interviewed neighbors, requested bank records, and pieced together the puzzle that we had handed them. The president's arrogance had left behind trails he could not erase. Each check he had authorized, each fine he had pocketed, each fabricated vote became part of the record. His past confidence, once his armor, now betrayed him, because only a man who believed himself untouchable would leave such blatant evidence in his wake. The day the patrol cars returned to our street, it felt different. This time, they did not come for me. They came for him. Neighbors gathered at their windows as uniformed officers knocked on his door. He emerged not with the swagger of authority but with the pale face of a man who finally realized his kingdom had crumbled. His protests fell flat against the quiet dignity of handcuffs clicking into place. For years he had used the police as his weapon, summoning them to intimidate, to enforce his false narratives. Now they were his undoing. Whispers spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some felt pity, others satisfaction. Most felt relief. The fear that had clung to our community like ivy had been ripped away at its roots. The man who had once lorded over us with bylaws and fines was gone, replaced by a vacancy that carried not uncertainty, but hope. In the weeks that followed, the board reorganized. New members stepped up, neighbors who had once stayed silent but now wanted transparency, fairness, balance. Meetings became less about punishment and more about solutions. The binder of rules, once a weapon, was treated as a guidebook, respected but not abused. Slowly, the scars of his reign began to heal. For me, the victory was more than personal. I had not only defended myself, I had helped unmask a tyrant hiding behind the illusion of order. The binder that once weighed down my carpet now sat proudly on a shelf, no longer a burden but a reminder that knowledge and persistence could topple even the most entrenched authority. Walking my dog along the greenbelt once again, I felt a freedom that had been missing since the first letter arrived in my mailbox. The grass stretched wide, the trees swayed in the breeze, and for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of eyes watching from across the street. My dog sniffed happily at the earth, tail wagging, oblivious to the battles that had been fought over his paw prints. Neighbors began to greet me openly now, some stopping to thank me, others simply nodding in quiet acknowledgement. Where there had once been isolation, there was now community. We had endured something corrosive together, and in surviving it, we had rediscovered a sense of solidarity. As for the president, his house remained dark, his lawn unkempt, a fitting symbol of the decay his greed had wrought. His absence was a silence nobody missed. The law would decide his fate, but his power here was finished. Looking back, I realized the irony. He had tried to weaponize the police against me, to have me arrested, humiliated, and broken. Instead, the police had become the very instrument of his downfall. His own ambition had undone him, and the community he once controlled now stood freer, stronger, and wiser for it. And so the story ended not with bitterness but with peace. The kind of peace that comes after surviving a storm, when the sky's clear and the air feels lighter. The kind of peace that makes a neighborhood feel like home again. The HOA had tried to get me arrested. But in the end, it was their president who was led away, and it was justice. And don't forget, hit that subscribe button so you never miss more crazy HOA and Karen revenge stories right here on PAWS Stories.